Constructed atop the ashes of the Second World War, the modern international legal order aimed, in the opening words of the United Nations Charter, to, quote, save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which has brought, quote, untold sorrow to mankind. But in Gaza, 2024, an entire generation has been lost. With the death toll soaring above 43,000, the United Nations describes the strip as, quote, a graveyard for children. And as the Gaza-based lawyer and director of the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, Raja Sarani, warns, Gaza may also prove to be, quote, a graveyard for international law. Either you have the rule of law or you have the rule of the jungle, he reminds us. And there is no in-between. Sarani knows this difference all too well. In October of 2023, Israel dropped a 2,000-pound bomb on his family home in Gaza. He narrowly escaped with his life. Today in Gaza, the rule of the jungle prevails. Backed unilaterally by the world's superpower, the United States, Israel tramples underfoot the United Nations Charter, along with virtually every international legal norm. My opening remarks here are going to focus on just one, the norm against the targeting and killing of civilians. This September, the London-based charity Oxfam reported that, quote, more women and children have been killed in Gaza by the Israeli military over the past year than the equivalent period of any other conflict over the past 2 decades. At least 6,000 women and 11,000 children have been killed in Gaza. That's more than the equivalent period in Iraq, in Syria, in Ukraine, and in Sudan. So it's no wonder then that the State of Israel now faces charges of genocide at the International Court of Justice. But its lawyers point to a ready-made answer for the Palestinian civilian death toll. Israel wants to avoid killing innocent civilians, we're told, but if the IDF does kill them, this is not its fault. Rather, it's the unavoidable result of Hamas's use of human shields. The death toll in Gaza may look ugly, but if we want someone to blame, we should blame Palestinian militants. They are the ones who are insisting on sacrificing their own civilian population to gain international sympathy. And ultimately, they are the ones who are making the State of Israel look bad. On its face, the claim that Israel is making well-intentioned efforts to protect Palestinian civilians is difficult to square with the repeated declarations of its own policymakers that there are, quote, no innocent people in Gaza, or that the Palestinians are, quote, human animals, or that the IDF is fighting, quote, Amalek, an enemy slated by the Bible to be destroyed, man, woman, and child. If the lyrics of chart-topping songs in your country include May Your Village Burn and Turning Gaza into a Parking Lot, you shouldn't express all too much surprise when the international community accuses you of the crime of genocide. But what else is wrong with the human shields discourse? Well, many things, but I'm going to keep it to 3. First, the claim is deeply, deeply hypocritical. Human rights organizations have for decades documented Israel's forcible conscription of Palestinian civilians as human shields, a systematic practice that continues to the very present. The New York Times, for example, has documented numerous cases of the IDF sending Gazan civilians into tunnels as human shields, while Israel's own leading newspaper, Haaretz, has demonstrated that this tactic is known to and implicitly sanctioned by senior Israeli commanders. In a novel innovation on a classic war crime, the IDF has furthermore been forcing these Palestinian human shields to wear Israeli army uniforms. Nev Gordon, an Israeli professor of international law and co-author of a landmark history on human shields, comments as follows, quote, human shielding has historically been predicated on recognizing that the person shielding a military target is a vulnerable civilian. And this recognition is meant to deter the opposing warring party from attacking the target because the vulnerability of the human shield invokes moral restraints on the use of lethal violence. Simply put, it's precisely the recognition of vulnerability that is key to the purported effectiveness of human shielding. In sharp contrast, by dressing Palestinian hostages in IDF army uniforms, the State of Israel is, quote, deploying human shields not to deter Palestinian fighters from striking Israeli soldiers, but rather to draw their fire and thus reveal their location, allowing the Israeli troops to launch a counterattack and kill the fighters. The moment these human shields, masked as soldiers, are sent into the tunnels, they are transformed from vulnerable civilians into fodder. Like hunters who use raw meat to lure animals they want to capture or kill, the Israeli troops use Palestinian civilians as if they were bare flesh, whose function is to attract the hunter's prey." End quote. This new form of human shielding in Gaza, Gordon concludes, appears unprecedented in the history of warfare. Second, even if, for argument's sake, we assume that Hamas is making widespread use of Palestinian civilians as human shields, Israel's attacks would still be disproportionate and therefore illegal. What does it mean for an attack to be disproportionate? International humanitarian law balances protection of civilian life on the one hand with military necessity on the other. What this means practically is that when your adversary hides behind human shields, the principle of proportionality allows you to make an attack that results in incidental loss of civilian life, so long as you're attempting to achieve a military objective. There is, however, a caveat. Loss of civilian life must not be excessive. But that, of course, simply begs a question. How many civilian deaths is excessive? Is it 5? Is it 10? If you have pacifist inclinations, the answer is easy. 1 civilian death is too many. But international law is more permissive. There is no universal metric for proportionality. Even so, as one expert has pointed out, quote, "The highest number of civilian casualties he has ever seen a Western military willing to tolerate in a single strike is 50 during the fight against Islamic State in Mosul." Compare this now with Israeli airstrikes. Not in the past year, but in the past month alone, the state of Israel has not just once or twice, but many times carried out strikes that killed close to or more than 100 civilians. Between October 23rd and November 1st of 2024, Israeli forces perpetrated 8 mass casualty events. In layperson's language, massacres. Among them was an October 24th strike on a residential block in Jabalia refugee camp, which killed between 150 and 200 Palestinians. An October 29th strike, which killed as many as 93. And a pair of strikes on November 1st, which killed many dozens of Palestinians, including 50 children. Even if these strikes were targeted at Palestinian militants shielding themselves behind civilians, they would still almost certainly be disproportionate. But the truth is, all this proportionality talk is just a red herring. In all the cases I just discussed, the IDF has to date provided no credible evidence that there even was a military target. And if history is any guide, these were intentional attacks on civilians. It might be replied that I'm cherry-picking the data, that even if particular Israeli strikes have been wildly disproportionate, the IDF's operation as a whole has targeted Hamas and not Palestinian civilians. Indeed, this is the claim of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's favorite war analyst, John Spencer. Spencer asserts that nearly half, 50% of Palestinians killed by Israel in Gaza have been combatants, meaning that Israel, quote, found a way to reduce civilian casualties to historically low levels. The main problem with this claim is that there's zero evidence to support it. I'll say that again. Zero. Spencer uncritically regurgitates the IDF's self-reported figure for the number of Palestinian militants it has killed. But this is a number for which Israel has refused to provide any evidence or even a methodology, despite repeated requests from journalists and human rights organizations. Fine, you might say, but still, what is the civilian to combatant ratio in Gaza? This is impossible to know for certain, but perhaps the best estimate we have was put out in late October by Matthew Cockerell of the NGO Action on Armed Violence, with endorsement from Michael Spagat, who is one of the most prominent scholars on wartime casualties in the world. Determining first that the figures presented by the Gaza Ministry of Health have proven credible in all previous Israeli wars on Gaza, and second, that it's safe to assume that per previous conflicts, all women, children, and senior citizens killed are indeed non-combatants. Cockerell III extrapolates from the proportion of the male combatant to civilian deaths in previous wars to arrive at a, quote, conservative figure of 74% Palestinian civilian casualties. And this figure, he notes, is likely to be an underestimate, and the real figure for Palestinian civilian casualties could be as high as 90%. In any event, the Palestinian civilian death toll is much worse than in comparable cases. For example, the civilian to combatant ratio for the brutal civil war in Syria, where less than 50% of all casualties are civilians. The catastrophic civilian death toll is unsurprising, given the nature of Israel's bombing campaign, which is responsible for a clear majority of Palestinian deaths since October 7th. In the first 6 days of the Israeli assault, the IDF dropped nearly as many explosives on tiny Gaza, 6,000 bombs, than the United States did in an entire year in Afghanistan. Almost half of the munitions Israel has dropped on Gaza have been unguided, meaning that they cannot be precisely targeted even if Israel did care about such a thing. By late April 2024, the State of Israel had dropped over 70,000 tons of bombs on Gaza, more than the bombing of Dresden, Hamburg, and London combined during the Second World War. Just last week, the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights independently verified and analyzed the deaths of over 7,600 Palestinians from Israel's airstrikes on residential homes. Its findings? Quote, "The strikes on residential buildings in Gaza since the 7th of October suggest a pattern of attacks inflicting casualties evenly as a proportion across the entire population, with high numbers of babies and young children, women, older persons, and families killed together in residential buildings." If Israeli airstrikes were truly targeting Hamas militants, you would expect to see a disproportionate number of young men amongst the dead. Yet the report found that fully 70% of those killed in the bombing of residential homes were women and children, roughly proportionate with the makeup of Gaza's population. And this suggests that the staggering rate of Palestinian civilian casualties in Gaza is not attributable to disproportionate Israeli strikes against legitimate military targets, but rather to the plain fact that since the 7th of October, the State of Israel has waged an indiscriminate bombing campaign targeting Gaza's entire population for death and destruction. As the United Nations report additionally noted, quote, "The continuation of these attacks, killing very evenly across the population for months, despite early evidence of the massive civilian harm suffered as a result, demonstrates an apparent indifference to the death of civilians and the impact of the means and methods of warfare selected." In other words, Palestinian civilian casualties really have very little to do with human shields, because despite its pretenses, the Israeli Air Force hasn't been targeting Hamas militants at all. Instead, for the past year, it's just bombed everywhere, trying to kill as many people as possible. This is not the logic of war, but the logic of genocide. And it speaks to my final and third point. We have strong evidence that most civilian deaths in Gaza are not due to the use of human shields by Palestinian militants, but rather to the explicit efforts of the Israeli military to target the Palestinian civilian population for death. Let's take as emblematic human shielding claims as they relate to just one element of Israel's assault on Gaza: its attacks on hospitals and medical personnel. Since October the 7th, the State of Israel has leveled catastrophic attacks against Gaza's entire health system. Of Gaza's 36 hospitals, 31 have been the target of attack, 11 have been subjected to siege, and fully 10 have been subjected to outright invasion and occupation. With only one exception, all hospitals in Gaza have been forced at one point or another in the past year to cease operations. In its oral testimony to the International Court of Justice and in the media, the State of Israel has sought to justify these assaults by claiming that Hamas systematically uses Gaza's medical system for military purposes. But what does the evidence actually show? Already in November of 2023, a Human Rights Watch investigation found that, despite Israeli claims, quote, "no evidence put forward would justify depriving hospitals and ambulances of their protected status." Last month, the London-based NGO, Forensic Architecture, dedicated over 100 pages to the study of Israel's assaults on Palestinian hospitals, noting A, that the Israeli military destroyed and occupied hospitals even after they had been forced out of service and evacuated, and B, that the timing of the Israeli military's attacks on the hospitals correlates with the presence of displaced civilians at those hospitals, forensic architecture concluded, C, that healthcare workers have been not indirect casualties, but, quote, the direct targets of the Israeli military. In October of 2024, the United Nations Human Rights Council's Commission of Inquiry, chaired by Navi Pillay, released a detailed report on Israeli attacks on 4 Palestinian hospitals the preceding year. It found that while Israeli security forces asserted that over 85% of major medical facilities in Gaza were used by Hamas for terror operations, they, quote, did not provide any evidence to substantiate that claim. Apart from a single firefight that broke out inside the grounds of Al-Shifa Hospital, the investigation either, quote, did not find evidence or, quote, could not verify the state of Israel's claims that the hospitals it had shelled, invaded, and destroyed had been used for military purposes. In every case it examined, the commission concluded that the hospitals ought to have been, quote, immune from such attacks, per international humanitarian law. Since the beginning of October, the state of Israel has placed the entirety of the northern Gaza Strip under siege, attempting to starve out the Palestinian civilian population still remaining there. Part of this assault has involved the encirclement and bombardment of 3 major hospitals in the north. And it's not the first time either. Just a week ago, the Associated Press published a long investigation of previous assaults on the same hospitals, based on months of evidence gathering, including dozens of interviews with patients, hospital administrators, and Israeli officials. What were its findings? At Al Adwa Hospital, attempting to enter or leave the hospital became a death sentence, as civilians waving white flags, pregnant mothers, and children were all targeted by Israeli snipers while on their way to the hospital. At the Indonesian hospital, Israeli shelling struck the 2nd floor, slaughtering 12 Palestinians. At Kamal Adwan Hospital, Israeli soldiers invaded, killed doctors and patients, and bulldozed patients alive in their tents outside the hospital. The investigation's conclusion, quote, Israel has presented little or even no evidence of a significant Hamas presence at any of the 3 hospitals. If anything, the evidence is consonant with the separate conclusion of the UN Commission of Inquiry, that Israel's assaults on Palestinian medical facilities, staff, and patients together constituted, quote, the crime against humanity of extermination. To conclude, genocide scholars have long noted that states engaged in genocidal violence stand to benefit from the depiction of their actions as warfare. In fact, in the modern world, where everything is caught on video and uploaded to the internet, it's probably impossible to get away with carrying out a genocide unless you've disguised it as warfare. It's through this prism, I believe, that Israel's human shielding claims ought to be analyzed. As Francesca Albanese, the United Nations Special Rapporteur for the Occupied Palestinian Territories, argues, since October 7th, the State of Israel has sought to turn Gaza as a whole into a military objective. Its foreign ministry has redefined the residents of the Gaza Strip as human shields, and accused Hamas of using the civilian population as a single human shield. And if the civilian population, all of it, is a human shield, then the civilian population, all of it, magically becomes a legitimate military target. In short, the State of Israel is camouflaging genocide in the language of international humanitarian law. Repudiating these and other rationalizations for Israel's genocidal violence, and achieving accountability for the Palestinian victims of this violence, is ultimately about more than just Gaza. It's also about preserving international law from the law of the jungle. At best, the West has been selective in its enforcement of the law and willing to grant legal impunity for Israel's crimes against humanity. At worst, it's been directly complicit. This is a rot. Left untreated, it will spread until it consumes the entire post-World War international legal edifice. The Third World rightfully asks us, if you will not enforce the law in Palestine, why in Ukraine? Indeed, why anywhere? If Palestine is not to become a graveyard for international law, the international community must take immediate and pressing action to end Israel's impunity. It must take action to prevent and punish the crime of genocide in Gaza.